Hello and welcome to Pints with Aquinas. I am Father Gregory Pine, joining you from Washington, D.C. I'm gearing up to go back to Switzerland this Sunday, so looking forward to flying internationally with all 7 of my best friends on a flight that seats 250. So that'll be great. In the meantime, though, just kind of wrapping up things here stateside. And this is the last Wednesday live stream while I'm in the United States for this summer. That's a heavily qualified last, but it's a last of a certain sort, so I feel like we should mark it with a kind of solemnity. I'm just kidding, but seriously. The theme of this live stream is inspired by a question that one Joshua Meyer sent to Godsplaining. So Godsplaining is the podcast that I do with 4 other Dominican friars. I would say if you're looking for things that are a little less philosophical, theological than Pints with Aquinas, Godsplaining is like a little more popular, so you might check that out. My usual explanation is like, you got Thomistic Institute, Pints with Aquinas, Godsplaining. So a little more accessible, even though, whatever. Yeah, there you go. So Joshua Meyer, using the subject line Protestant infiltration, which I thought was, pretty cheeky, so kudos to Joshua Meyer. He sent in this question: if all that is in God is God, and his will is identical with his being, how can God's being be necessary, yet his will be truly free? Which is an excellent question. So thus inspiring the theme of this here opening sequence, which is, can a simple God be free? So in order to suss this out, or in order to think through this with a modicum of clarity, I figure we could just draw some distinctions at the outset and then propose a kind of provisional response, even though this is the type of thing which is not going to be explained away, as it were, or isn't going to be comprehensible in the sense that our human minds can wrap around this mystery which exceeds the compass of our nature. So here are some helpful things. First, I think it's helpful to clarify the divine attributes which are at stake, and first of which would be simplicity. So in our understanding, we tend to think of simplicity as somehow a limitation or a liability, right? We would say that a person who isn't intelligent is simple, or we even refer to them by the substantive simpleton. And like kind of in our estimation of things, the more complex a thing is, the more intelligent it is, the more it is worthy of consideration, the more that it might admit of investigation. So we have a hard time thinking of God as endlessly intelligible and simple, because how do you get all the intelligible things in there if it's simple? And here, I think it's simply to say, I think it's helpful to say that simplicity is like what we envision by complexity, but in a supereminent form, or in a way that contains virtually or eminently what we would associate with complexity. So to say a thing is simple isn't to say that it's dull, dumb, undeveloped, or otherwise incomplex. In the case of God, it's to say that he pre-contains all of the complexity of lower things, but he pre-contains them in a somehow unified fashion. So I think a helpful analogy can be drawn with the way in which we understand and angels understand. So if you don't understand a thing too terribly well, you understand it by a variety of concepts. So you might be, working on a car, and you don't necessarily see how everything in the car interreacts or interrelates. And so you have to have notions of each of the different aspects of each of the different components. And for you, it kind of feels like an exercise in memorization, or you just watch a YouTube video if you have to make even the most simple of repairs. But for a mechanic, he thinks of the car ecosystematically. He thinks about it as all pertaining to kind of one system, the parts of which need be interrelated or need to interact in a harmonious way if the car is to function. And so he can judge by a little rattle, or he can judge by a kind of wheezy coughing sound coming from the muffler, that all of these different interrelated problems are kind of at stake when it comes to diagnosing the problem with this vehicle. So he's able to understand all of these different things, but with fewer concepts, because he has a kind of embracing notion or embracing concept of the car's health, etc. St. Thomas describes the concepts of higher angels in a similar fashion. So he says the higher the angel, the fewer the concepts that angel has, but the concepts are more embracing, they're more provident, and this reaches its term, its limit, in God, who has one notion, as it were, of all that is, and that notion sees to it that, those things proceed strongly and sweetly to their term, to God, and we call that one notion providence. So when we talk about simplicity in God, we're talking about an eminent form of being, right? Or like an eminent form of what we're going to talk about subsequently as causality, so like a kind of causal plural potency. So this is what we mean by simplicity, and this is what usually is in the background of the claim that all that is in God is God. So you'll often hear it say like God is his love, God is his wisdom, God is his, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So in that case, when we say that all that is in God is God, we're saying that God is simple, and so his attributes are to be, in a certain sense, identified. Okay, so that's what we mean by simple. Next concept that we want to clarify is free. What does it mean to say that God is free? When St. Thomas talks about freedom, he talks about it in the part of the Summa that concerns human agency, so we're going to have to purify these concepts of some human-specific elements. But he talks about it under two aspects. He says there's freedom of exercise, and then there's freedom of specification. So freedom of exercise is basically the freedom to do or not to do. And then the freedom of specification is the freedom derived from the fact that whenever we're engaging with some good, some limited good, we're free to see it under this aspect or under that aspect. Like today is Wednesday. It's Wednesday afternoon, East Coast time, and I can see this live stream under different aspects, right? I can see it as helpful for communicating the truth, or I can see it as like potentially burdensome if it interrupts something that I would prefer to do. So let's say that, ex hypothese per impossibile, the 76ers were currently playing Game 7 of the NBA championship. And I would begin then to see this live stream as an obstacle to my watching that basketball game. And so because it's a limited good, both of the goods under consideration, I am free to see them under this or that light. So as a result of which, our will is not bound to do one or the other. Our will is inclined towards the good, but we kind of have to sort out which of those goods commands our attention most. Now, when we talk about freedom in terms of our human experience, we typically talk about it as a matter of opting for different options. So if we want to, identify what is the core or what is the most basic element of freedom, in effect, because we are this type of thing, a human being, we are inclined towards certain goods that are good for us. And what we do by volition, by freedom, by free will, is that we kind of ratify certain of those inclinations by an interior principle. So you're inclined to food, drink, sexual intercourse. You're inclined towards, like family life or civil society. You're inclined towards the knowledge of God and worship, right? So there's a variety of goods set before you as a human being that correspond to who you are and what represents your flourishing. But we would consider those acts free, which, moved by these inclinations, as it were, kind of sort among those goods and ratify certain goods to the exclusion of, or maybe to the subordination of, others. That's kind of at the heart of human freedom. So then when we talk about freedom in the quote-unquote divine experience, which is a little bit of a silly way to speak, but I speak that way nonetheless, we need to purify it of certain human limitations. So for one, God doesn't need things. So God doesn't go out towards things as somehow completing his nature, because there's nothing lacking to God's nature. God doesn't experience anything even resembling need, because God is super sufficient to himself. So at the end of the day, what God wills is himself, because in a certain sense, there's nothing outside of himself. You can read Robert Sokolowski's The God of Faith and Reason, and what he describes as the Christian distinction is that God plus creation is not greater than God. So creation is just a kind of limited participation in the life of God, but it itself is a kind of expression of God. It's not an addition to God. So there's not, like in a certain sense again, something outside of God to will. Don't be worried. Okay, so we're not talking about this in pantheistic or panentheistic terms, but simply to say that God wills himself and that he wills everything in willing himself. So God's willing of those things without him are, in effect, expressions of his willing of himself, or he wills them in willing himself. Okay, so that's talk a little bit about divine simplicity. and then divine volition or will, as it were, divine freedom. So then the last kind of linking concept is to talk a little bit about the divine ideas. And ordinarily you talk about knowledge before you talk about will, but I thought that this arrangement might be a little bit more helpful. And then we could talk about what it means for God to be necessary, and that should bring us to where we want to arrive. So the divine ideas. We've talked about this before on the show, but the divine ideas represent effectively the different ways in which God can be participated, or in which God's being can be expressed in limited creaturely form. So God, in knowing himself, knows all of the different ways in which creation can partake of his divine abundance. And you could think about it as like an omniscient artist who knows all of the different ways in which, or all of the different vantages from which, a portrait, a self-portrait, could be drawn. So Father James Brent explains this beautifully in the Aquinas 101 video on God's knowledge, where he pictures a model in the middle of a kind of circle of artists with their easels, each of which paints it from a different vantage. And so the divine ideas are kind of like that. God sees himself from every imaginable created vantage, and that's part of his knowing of himself. That's part of his exhaustive knowledge of himself. Now, God's causality extends as far as his knowledge, or his knowledge extends as far as his causality. And so, while we don't want to say that the divine ideas are like a kind of blueprint for creation, as if there were a first moment, which, the divine ideas comprise, and then a second moment, which creation comprises, but rather we want to simply say that God conjoins his will, or God wills that certain of these things take form, or take actual, real existence, and to others, he does not conjoin his will, or he does not desire or effectively bring it about that they take actual or real existence. So there is a sense in which there are things that are in the divine mind that are not in our experience of reality, and then there are things which are in the divine mind which are in our experience of their reality. That's not to say that, maybe I can just leave that to one side. I won't clarify this out of existence. So another way of describing this is to say that all that is pre-exists in God in his active potency. So there's no potency in God in the sense of passive potency. God can't become other than he is, because God just subsists as being. God's very nature is to be. There's nothing of to be which is foreign to God. There's nothing of to be which is lacking to God. But God's to be is so potent, so fruitful, so fecund, that it can be expressed in a variety of creaturely forms. And the divine ideas are, as a certain sense, those ways, right? Those possibles. And then the ones that do exist are those to which he conjoins his will. Now, to bring it back then to simplicity and freedom, and to begin to answer or solve, though we're not going to solve, this question of whether a simple God can be truly free, we would then begin to just kind of discuss or establish that God inclines to these different, pure possibles, these different divine ideas, insofar as he is inclined towards himself. So it's not as if God is sorting out different options and thinking this one looks good to me and this one doesn't look good to me, and I pick this because it's the best possible and I pass over this because it's not the best possible. That's not the type of calculus which is underway. Rather, God is inclined towards himself, not as lacking himself, but as the kind of spontaneous movement of divine volition, attendant upon divine intellection, not attendant in a temporal way or in a causal way, but just in the sense that God moves spontaneously towards himself, not moving in the sense of activating a potency, but as a kind of interior, abundant dynamism. All right? And so God is inclined towards himself. God wills himself. God, who is his existence, who is his will, who is his act of volition, who is the object of his volition, wills himself in his willing. And that movement he ratifies by a kind of interior principle, which we identified earlier with respect to human volition as the kind of heart of what it means to be free. So we would affirm, with respect to God's volition, that it could have been otherwise. So St. Thomas asks in Prima Pars question 25 about the power of God, and in Article 6 he asks, is this the best possible world? Basically, did God conjoin his will to the maximal or optimal set of divine ideas right? In such a way that it does not exclude other maximal or optimal divine ideas. This is, kind of like an operations research problem in which God gives expression to the most saturated divine content that creation can, accommodate. And he says no, right? Scripture testifies to the fact that God could have done otherwise, and in a certain sense could have done better. So God could have done it this way rather than that way, right? We could... And, here in a certain sense, you're in conversation with biological science or chemical science, but, we could be other than we are. And I don't want to drive that point too terribly hard before getting into the, scientific weeds of the matter. But, we could have wings, for instance. So we could have been other than we were. We could potentially have been better. We could potentially have been worse. But God chose this particular thing as part of his inclining spontaneously, not out of need, not out of lack, to himself. His ratifying that inclination to himself, as it were, in freedom, perfect freedom. And we are part of the expression thereof. So you would see in this particular choice, as it were, a kind of freedom, a kind of divine freedom, insofar as it could have been this way rather than that way, or could have been that way rather than this way, and also in the sense that it could have been otherwise, in the sense that God always wills himself, but he doesn't necessarily will us in the way that he wills us, or needn't have willed us. So this really gets to the heart of the matter. Could God, so just to go back to the question at the top of the hour, if all that is in God is God, right? So if God is simple and the divine attributes are to be identified with God, and if his will is identical with his being, which is to say his will is, he subsists after the manner of to be, but also after the manner of to will, how can God's being be necessary and yet be free? So the question is, does his choice to create kind of collapse into the divine necessity? And here, we're just trying to clarify a little bit of what it means for God to be free. So we've identified this interior movement, but now we're trying to identify these aspects of freedom of exercise and freedom of specification. So God wills himself in creation, but he wills himself in not creation. So there's a necessity to his willing of himself. But whether he wills himself in this way or that, right, that concerns details which are less fundamental to the consideration of his freedom than that basic point which we have established. So, and then with respect to specification, we've already kind of teased that out with respect to the divine power. So maybe let's just try to shed some further light on these things. And I realize that I'm speaking for more than 10 minutes, but this is a really thorny issue. And I should also say, too, that I've just kind of been thinking about this for the past few days and writing down notes as they occur to me here, there, and everywhere. But this is still a work in progress. So if you have thoughts on how this analysis could benefit from further exploration, or how in which, ways in which it's, inadequate or wrong, just shoot those to me through something. Email godsplaining@ops.org. Okay, so then final considerations, which I hope which will be a little bit helpful. What about the time factor? So when you introduce the factor of time, oftentimes it seems like because God willed this or foreordained this, then it could not have been otherwise. And you run these kind of problems with respect to determinism and human volition, but it also pertains to this current question. So I think that people think about eternity and time in a variety of ways, but the way in which I think it's most helpful to envision it is to describe eternity, as St. Thomas describes it, as the whole and simultaneous possession of endless life. And there he is drawing from St. Severinus Boethius. So for him, eternity is a matter of, on account of the fact that God possesses wholly and entirely his endless life, there's no succession in God, there's no progression in God, there's no discursion in God. God just is, subsists as to be in such a way that needs no unfolding, needs no developing, right? And as a result of which, God possesses all that we, in our experience of time, only gradually come into possession of. So eternity isn't so much a matter of endless duration as it is a matter of kind of like metaphysical omnicompetence. So then when we talk about our experience of time, obviously, we're just kind of plodding through steps. And we tend to think about creation as this kind of time-bound thing which God foresaw, and on account of the fact that he foresaw it and had willed it from the dawn of whatever, his eternity, then it could not have been otherwise, and as a result of which God could not have created. But I think that's, in a certain sense, to think about eternity and time after the manner of duration rather than into metaphysical possession of life. So with respect to time, so time and place are concreated. The real heart of creation is a dependence upon God for one's being. So on account of the fact that we are metaphysically dependent, or in a certain way metaphysically limited, we only ever come into possession of our life as this, as the fruit of, struggle or maturation, or however you want to describe it. So our experience of time is a limited expression of God's experience of eternity, and I'm using experience there super broadly. But basically, we're metaphysically thin, we're metaphysically limited, and as a result of which, we just kind of pull ourselves through our experience of creation. But in the case of God, there's no pulling himself through. There's just subsisting after the manner of to be. And when he makes other things to be, as it were, with his choice comes time and place. With his choice comes all that is concreated, as it were. So it's not as if God is somehow in time, or before time, or pre-existent even. Some of that language is a little bit complicated or a little bit problematic. So when talking about the time factor, it's just not the case that succession just doesn't apply to God as it does to human beings. So when we speak about it's necessary that God create because he foresaw himself creating, that's to put the cart before the horse, or that's to kind of muddle the matter conceptually. So we can speak of a kind of necessity to creation, but only as a kind of contingent necessity on the part of creation. Because creation is, therefore it is necessary that it is, in the way that, Aristotle will describe contingent necessity. Because Socrates is sitting, it's necessary that Socrates is sitting. But that's downstream of the historical fact of God's choice to create, which itself is only ever conditioned by God's to be. So it's not conditioned by his foreseeing of a thing. It's actually his notion of the thing, his divine idea, is simultaneous to his willing of the thing. Again, it's not two moments, like blueprint and then subsequent choice, as if God were working out the details. No. And this is debated hotly in scholarly literature, or at least it was like 25 years ago, and then was picked back up a couple years ago. But God is in no way reacting to creation. God is in no way dependent upon creation. God is in no way responsive to creation. And mind you that this doesn't preclude, like God being merciful or compassionate in all the ways in which he's described in biblical language. So God, to speak of God and his necessity, is to speak of necessity in a particular way. Okay, so he is being, subsisting through himself, and there's no principle whereby God could be otherwise, as it were. So it's necessary, in the sense of absolutely necessary, that God is what God is, but that's just a necessity that flows from the fact of his being, right? So it's not necessary that God be as he is. So how do I want to explain this? I'm just looking at my notes and I'm realizing that, this is the haymaker, right? So this is the last point. It's not necessary that God be this way or that way, because God isn't a particular way. God just is. God's very nature is to be. And there's a kind of necessity that's, again, attendant upon that, but it's not necessary, like God doesn't have to be this way or that way. God just is. Okay, God just is. So there's an absolute necessity to God's being, God, and to God's, knowing and willing. But as to the particular details of God's knowing and willing, there's a liberty both of exercise and of specification on account of the fact that God is not conditioned by the creation. Creation is dependent upon him. He is in no wise dependent upon the creation, except so far as he is, in a certain sense, bound by his dictate. So we can say that there's a kind of suppositional necessity to the fact that creation is, given that it is, right? But at the heart of that is the fact that God wills himself, right? God wills himself. And, his willing of the particular ways in which himself is expressed is, a subsequent consideration, a related consideration, but not the heart of the matter. So I realize that, that's a lot of principles and doesn't necessarily explain away all of the conceptual knots or aporia, but I hope that at least some of that is metaphysically helpful, and that other people will extend the conversation in such a way as to bring it to its logical terminus or supply for what is lacking in its expression. So, in short, it is not necessary that God be as he is, as we are kind of accustomed to understand that, because God isn't a particular way. God just is to be. And it's not necessary that God wills as he does. He wills himself, right? He doesn't will in a particular way, except from the side of the creation. And in there, we would recognize a suppositional necessity, but that's not the same as the absolute necessity that God be who he is on account of the fact that it's his very nature to be. So, can a simple God be free? I think the answer is yes. And to restate Joshua Meyer's question, if all that is in God is God, and his will is identical with his being, how can God's being be necessary, yet his will be truly free? So all that is in God is God, right? That we're affirming, that the simplicity of his divine nature. His will is identical with his being, but, seen from different aspects, we're going to highlight different kind of facets of that insofar as his being is ipsum esse per se subsistence, his very nature is to be, and his willing is a willing of himself, okay? Then with respect to God's relation vis-a-vis creation, right? God truly being free, and I'm just kind of like focusing the question of God's freedom vis-a-vis creation because that's often the way in which it comes up. God could have done otherwise insofar as God's choosing of this versus that aspect of creation, although both might be patterned after the divine nature, is free insofar as God inclines towards himself, ratifies the movement of that inclination by one simple movement, but that he be expressed in this way or that is a secondary consideration than that he will himself. So, yeah, I think that's the beginning of an answer. And 10 minutes became 23. Let's go. All right, folks. So we got some questions here. Let's go ahead and get to them, and we'll do our best, and then we'll move on from there. So CDC says, what does it mean for Jesus to have been tempted if it was impossible for him to have sinned? So a good way by which to think about that is that the temptations kind of crash up against his adamantine, divinized humanity, and that his living of those temptations imparts to us a grace to pass through our own temptations and to do so efficaciously by clinging to the God who makes himself known in his Christ. So he's not tempted in the way in which we are tempted, which is to say that we can potentially have the order of reason overturned in our choice. But he is tempted insofar as he faces the material conditions of temptation and that he passes through them as the God-man, affirming the order of reason and of divine will, like of the divine dictate, in such a way as to communicate to us a grace in that moment. Boom. DMT Core says, what is a good personality type / characteristics for a diocesan priest? I am ISTJ, so I worry that my introversion will be a problem. Can your personality be a sign that you are not called to do this? Hey, good question. I don't really know much about personality inventories or how indicative they are of being well or maladjusted to life. I myself also happen to be an ISTJ. I think I recall that. I think I took this like 11 years ago. So yeah, is introversion an obstacle to being a good priest? I don't think so, right? But I think that a personality type or temperament is just kind of an indication of certain strengths and certain weaknesses, which lays out for you, after the manner of self-knowledge, things that you're going to have to work on accentuating and things that you're going to have to work on mitigating. But I don't know that there's a personality type that is ill-suited. There might be certain personality types that are better suited, but I don't think that any one personality type precludes. Boom. Kathy Salter says, I'm busy this evening, but will enjoy the replay. Thank you. Cheers. Chicken of Bristol says, hi, Father Pine. Silly question, but how does one go about becoming friends with a priest? Continued below. My parish priest is scheduled too tightly to form a close relationship with my family, and I don't know how to find ways to interact in person with an order like the Dominicans. Hey, good question. I would say you offer invitations and try not to offer them too frequently, but offer them with a kind of spirit of abandon. Be like, yeah, we're doing this thing. You're most welcome. And then see if, it's like making any other friend. Although priests might be harder nuts to crack insofar as, they can be weirder. But yeah, I wouldn't say that there's a different strategy for befriending a priest than befriending anyone else. As C.S. Lewis once said, in order to have friends, you need to want something more than friends. So it's good to find common interests in any avenue of potential friendship. Ba-boom. Okay, Janet Tsiki says, I had an experience of holy fear that made everything seem trivial / fake. My initial reaction was, I don't know what to do with that, and went back to living life. I can revisit that feeling during prayer at times, but can't be deep for very long, so it makes me feel like I'm ignoring it and worry I'm getting complacent. Now I feel stuck. Advice. She says, P.S. Sorry, kind of vague question, but limited characters. Thanks for all you do. Cheers. So yeah, oftentimes like an experience of holy fear, like maybe at one point you have a pretty profound sense that it's possible for a human to go to hell, and that can be very disturbing or unsettling. Or maybe it's of a different sort. So that would be a kind of servile fear, a fear of punishment, which is still a good thing, but kind of on its way towards a yet more perfect fear, which we would call filial fear or chaste fear, which fears offending God. So maybe you might think about your sins in light of the divine sublimity and find that especially horrifying and be terrified as a result. But I think that the solution comes in the recognition that perfect love casts out fear, fear of a bad sort, right? Mundane fear, the type of fear which fears the loss of worldly goods. And it trains us in true fear. So it moves us from servile fear to initial fear to chaste or filial fear, which fear ultimately roots us and kind of, solidifies us in our friendship with the Lord. So I think that ultimately fear, if it is good, will cause us to cling to the Lord more closely. And there are helpful ways by which to go about that, but the words of St. Catherine of Siena come to mind where she says, "Never think of your sins apart from my mercy," which doesn't mean give yourself a free pass and explain away your many limitations, weaknesses, sins, temptations, failings, etc. But it means to say, like, think about God, right? Think about these things in the presence of God. So if it proves too much for your heart to bear at a certain moment, I don't think that it's cowardly to turn away from it. But insofar as God gives you to fear and the way that he gives you to fear, think about that with him, in him, through him, and then you'll find some kind of concrete direction or guidance. Boom. Okay. I've now remembered to put questions on the screen, and I will do that. Yep. So, Talia says, "Hello, Father Pine. Why do we ask Mary to turn thine eyes of mercy towards us, and in thy mercy hear and answer me? Also, you are the only consolation God gives me, excluding Jesus. Thank you." So I recognize the first two prayers. I don't recognize the third and final one. But with respect to the first, so what we're asking there is a particular kind of mercy. So which is to say a kind of pity, which seeks to relieve the pains associated with misery. So our Blessed Mother merited during her life, and part of her life of heaven as its queen, and of, her continued ministrations on earth as its queen, is to help those, to succor those who still lie in wait in this valley of tears. And so, by God's good pleasure, she administers her merits throughout the course of our earthly lives, because God wants that his grace be given through her. And so we're asking her to do just that, right? Effectively, we're opening our eyes to her, to her ministrations. We're opening our hearts to her ministrations. And then with respect to the last, "You are the only consolation God gives me," it's understood, insofar as God gives it, that God is the source of that consolation, and, in fact, the consolation present in every ministerial or instrumental consolation. So that doesn't exclude Jesus. Boom. Grant Levesque asks, "What is the meaning of life? To know, love, and serve God in this life and to enjoy him in the next." And I think, meaning is a particular kind of question. And there's a good Thomistic Institute talk about the meaning of life, which argues that to ask that question is kind of foreign to the ancient and medieval mindset, which would ask more about what is the end of life. So I think meaning is to be derived from the end. So you focus on God, right? And then things take shape accordingly. But if you get lost, whether it be in an oversensitivity to your own psychological states while probing the question, or to existential musings of whatever sort, then it can be a little bit destabilizing and cause you to drift. But I think goal-oriented discourse is the best mode of discourse insofar as our life is a goal-oriented life. So I think you can just answer that simply and say God. We are to be so many expressions of God's glory, and our salvation is bound up in that. Boom. Okey-doke. Scribbling Scribe says, "The Catechism of the Catholic Church seems to always describe the Eucharist as Jesus' real and substantial presence. To what extent is it accurate or inaccurate to describe it as his physical presence?" Yeah, so Christ is present locally or physically in one place, and that's in heaven. He's present in the Eucharist under the form of a sign, which is what we mean by sacramental presence, and then in the mode of substance, which is to say, where there is the substance, which formerly was bread and wine, now there is the substance, which is his body, blood, soul, and divinity. Under the appearance of bread and wine, which are made, as it were, to suspend, or are suspended by the power of God alone, which don't adhere in the actual substance itself. So it's present as substance, but with no accompanying accidents inhering in the thing itself, which would distinguish it from for Christ's local presence or physical presence in heaven. So it's a matter of kind of keeping those things straight. I hope that is helpful. All right, Benedict says, what would happen if someone committed a mortal sin and then they suffered amnesia before they had an opportunity to go to confession, losing their memory of their sin? So presumably, the next time they go to confession, they recount all of the mortal sins of which they're conscious, and provided that they do not preclude or like suppress the confession of any mortal sins, then all of their mortal sins are forgiven. So that's also good news for you, because even if you forget a mortal sin, it is forgiven, provided that you make a good examination of conscience here, like your normal length, I don't know, maybe 3-5 minutes, something like that. And then go to confession, confess to your best ability, and then leave. Even if you were to remember that sin later, it's still forgiven, okay? It'd be good to confess it at your next confession so that you could have a salutary penance assigned for it. But it being confessed, it is already been forgiven at the last confession, because you made the effort to confess all of the mortal sins of which you were conscious, and that's sufficient for a valid confession. Ba-boom. All right. Sam Piasecki says, can someone else's actions affect your glory in heaven? If you're going to be a priest and got a lot of glory in heaven from it, but someone cuts off your hand so you can't, whoosh. Why/can they change it? Yes. So other people can affect your glory in heaven insofar as, we're all bound up with each other. So I think it's helpful to answer this question, or even to envision this question, in terms of the virtue of prudence. So recall, prudence isn't looking for the optimal or maximal or unique response to a situation. Prudence is seeking to act in accord with virtue. So things will happen to you in your life. Some good things, some bad things. And you might be struck by the sense, or even haunted by the sense, that it could have been otherwise, right? It could have been better. It could have been more glorious. But that's really not our business, okay? That's not really our business in the least. Our business is to take what is given, right? To take what is set before us, and then to choose virtuously, which is to say, to choose in such a manner that comports with virtue. Consequences are part of that consideration, but they're not the whole of that consideration. Really, what's at the heart of that consideration is to choose according to the rule of reason, and to choose in a way that is befitting you and your historical, contingent, personal, free approach to whatever particular consideration is at hand. So yes, it could have been true that you had virtues which suited you to a priestly life. Your hands got cut off. You could no longer serve as a priest, but you have the confidence that, provided that you consent to and cooperate with the grace that God gives, that you will be made as holy as God wills you to be made holy. So God's consequent will, his efficacious will, takes into account all of the different circumstances in life, and as a result of which, right, he orchestrates it such that we will never be left without what is sufficient for our salvation, sufficient for his glory in our lives. And the way in which we give expression to that may be this way or maybe that way. It could have been some other way still, but we'll never know that, right? Because it's just not subject to our particular providence, which is to say, to our prudence. We can only work with what we have been given. We are responsible to work with what we have been given, and that's part of the drama. That's part of the excitement of human life. So we shouldn't be paralyzed by fear that there could be something better else out there, and that someone else might obstruct us or impede us from attaining to those heights. We should be preoccupied with the good that lies before us, the good to be done, the good that we can do, and then seek to carry it out. Boom. The Ractory, oh my gosh, I can't talk. The Factory Rat Genius says, boom, shades. That's awesome. Here we go. Johnny Pop-Tart says, hey, Father, does praying in my dreams count as actual prayer? I would say not really. Not as a substitute for actual prayer, but maybe as the overflow of actual prayer. So don't let it replace actual prayer, but maybe be delighted that you got it going. I'm just impressed that you can actually you can remember that. Okay. All right. Got some questions, got some comments. Just keeping going down here. Scrolling down the old scroll box of life. All right. There's a question about palimism, which I still don't know anything about. I apologize. I've said that I was going to study that. I haven't. All right, we got some sweet color commentary. John Paul Gies asks, what is that tune you're humming between things? No idea. Maybe I made it up. Maybe I picked it up from somewhere. No way to verify. All right, Caden Cramsey says, Father Pine, do you pray in the Latin? I offer Mass in Latin from time to time, both the Novus Ordo in Latin and then the Dominican Rite. But apart from that, I've prayed the Rosary in Latin a handful of times, but I say the Breviary in English. I say the Rosary in the native tongue of whichever country I'm living in. So English, French, sometimes Spanish, but apart from that. Yada-dee. All right, Kraft says, Father seems going down to go back to St. Gallen, Switzerland. I'm actually not in St. Gallen. I'm on the other side of the country in Freiburg. Let's go. Oh, yeah, you caught it. You changed it. There you go. So DMT Core says, can you sin in heaven? If not, why? Because Adam and Eve did, or the fallen angels. So Adam and Eve and the fallen angels were actually created outside of heaven. So they were created in grace, but not yet in glory, which is what we would associate with heaven. So Adam and Eve had the opportunity to ratify the state of grace in which they were created. They chose against that. So too with the fallen angels, as a result of which the fallen angels were banished to hell. In the case of Adam and Eve, we don't know, but angels attain to their end by one movement, which movement is irreversible, whereas we attain to our end by many movements. So even after Adam and Eve sinned, there's still a kind of hope for them. And you cannot sin in heaven because you see God, and God is such that he wholly sates the inquiry of both intellect and will. So we talked earlier about freedom of specification, which is to say you're free to see this thing under this light or under that light, and as a result of which you're free to choose for or against it. But in the case of God, you are not free to see it under this or that light. And maybe that's a little bit of a help to the earlier conversation, because God is wholly satisfying. He is the very to be itself. And as a result of which, he leaves nothing to be desired. So you can't see him from a light which is in any way deficient, or from an aspect that is in any way deficient or not wholly satisfactory. So God commands our ascent in such a way that we cannot look away. Yada-dee. All right, here we go. Jason M. says, Hi, Father. Will we recognize people we knew in life when we are in heaven? Will we be able to meet saints such as Paul or Mary and angels like Michael, or must we wait until the resurrection of the body? I think insofar as God gives us to know and to recognize others, we will know and recognize them. So we won't have the ordinary means whereby we attain to knowledge of things, because we will be separated from our bodies until such time, as you rightly identify, as the resurrection of the body. But, St. Thomas opines that we will retain those intelligible species which we accumulated during the course of our life, and perhaps have them added to in light of the new state that we occupy in purgatory or in heaven, and that God can give us to know, even without bodies, both on our part and that of the other whom we are encountering, can give us to know those other people by virtue of the intellectual, kind of conceptual knowledge that we have. Like he'll say similar things about interactions among angels. Like he'll talk about angelic speech and how God gives angels to communicate with each other so that we could affirm something comparable of souls after their death. I hope that is helpful. Yada-dee-dee. Carrie Nevins says, what book of the prophets is your favorite? Isaiah. Yada-da. Okay. Hello, Father Pine. Armand Babakanian says, do you consider Candace and Dietz as legitimate female theologians? How do you recommend Christians to highlight their significance? I don't actually know who Candace and Dietz are. I kind of live under a rock. So apologies for that. And if I show any disrespect to the aforementioned, again, sorry. All right. We got some stuff here about dreams, human agency, lucid dreaming, deep sleep. This is wild. Hallelujah says, don't yell at Father Pine. Hey, cheers. Thanks. All right, we got a repeat of the question from CDC. All right, Philip Schneitsky says, is there officially a church teaching about whether the Garden of Eden and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil actually existed, or is it acceptable to view them more as literary devices? I know of no teaching that affirms their literal existence or literalistic existence. I can think of certain documents, certain encyclicals, right, of the modern papacy, like Providentissimus Deus, or like Divina Flante Spiritu, or like Dei Verbum, for instance, which give guidance on the reading of scriptures and which leave open a kind of like mythological, as it were, interpretation, especially of the first 11 chapters of Genesis, which isn't to say that they're false, but it is to say that they're communicating in a way within the context of their own literary genre, which is not so much trivializing historical details so much as it makes use of literary devices as a way by which to express theological or philosophical or, deeper truths. So it doesn't have the same kind of preoccupations as modern historiography. So I think that we could affirm something like that. And while those encyclicals might give some guidance, further guidance still would be given by less official documents, like things published by the Pontifical Biblical Commission. And you could look up interpretation of the scriptures in the church as one example of that. Oh, yeah, we're cooking. Kyle M. says, any book recs for a 20-year-old Catholic guy? Yeah, I have many. One would be Orthodoxy by G.K. Chesterton, which I love. Another would be The Light of Christ by Father Thomas Joseph White, both of which are really good popular apologetics, so I'd start with those. Boom! All right, Kai says, what does it mean to pray in faith? If I pray for something, do I try to convince myself that what I pray for will happen, or does God help us with that? No, it doesn't mean that you try to just kind of convince yourself that God will do it. It's not about like ginning up the courage or about kind of inducing a psychological frenzy. It's about praying for the things necessary for salvation and to do so devoutly and perseveringly. So it means continuing. It means making it such that you can intend and attend to the prayer at hand. And it means doing so in a way that is focused on what is necessary for salvation. And that's just prayer and faith. So faith, the letter to the Hebrews describes, chapter 11, verse 1, as the assurance of things hoped for, the evidence of things unseen. So it entails a kind of trust element, which we would associate in part with the virtue of hope. So there's this sense that you believe in God, right? You believe God. You believe in God, and you believe unto God. So you believe that God is, you believe in what God says, and you believe with a kind of affective tendency towards God. And as a result of which, like the relationship becomes primary, more so than the kind of currency, as it were, or the medium of exchange. So I think faith is always person-centered, and that's in part what it means to pray in faith. Yet-da-dee-dum-dee. All right. Cooking. Nice. I love these things. Okay. Sarah says, read The Everlasting Man by G.K. Chesterton. I haven't, but it sounds really good. I have twice, and I don't understand what it's about. Other people do, so it's just one of those ones. Sometimes G.K. just totally defies my comprehension. That's one of the ones. I find Orthodoxy a lot more approachable. The Father Brown stories are probably the most approachable yet, so cheers. Oh yeah, we are cooking. Man, you got some serious stuff going on in this comment box. Woo! Oh my gosh, things are heating up. Okay. All right, well, may as well here we go. All right, Father, I have a friend who argues that couples need to determine if they have sexual chemistry before marriage because that's a big problem spouses have. Is that a problem in Catholic marriages? Part 1 of 2, part 2 of 2. I know that virtue is the most important thing to recognize in the person you marry, but physical chemistry is important too. How can you determine that while remaining chaste before marriage? I don't know, is a short answer. I have some vague ideas, is the longer one. So I think that while there may be some substance to that, I mean, I don't know. I think that God has it set up such that those who are virtuous, right, will have nothing lacking to them in the end, which doesn't mean that, like, if you do the right thing, everything will be happy-go-lucky. Like, no, you might get pancreas cancer, or you might get hit by a bus, right? Or you might be forced into a situation in which you feel yourself entirely compromised, or face the risk of losing your job. Okay, so life can still be exceedingly difficult even if you comport yourself with virtue. So I don't want to be, like, naive or Pollyanna-ish about this. But I don't think that it will be necessary, like, kind of given what we know in the Catholic faith concerning the virtue of chastity. It pertains to those not yet married to abstain from sexual intercourse, because sexual intercourse is ordered to the procreation and education of children, and children basically are meant to be begotten and raised in a family setting because that conduces best to their flourishing. That's kind of like St. Thomas's natural law argumentation regarding fornication or, adultery. Okay. So in this case, then, how do you supply for this X factor, which seems very important? And I don't deny that it's important. I think that sometimes the risk is that if you become sexually active before you get married, that you can actually short circuit other ways by which of growing in communication. So I think that typically men are more inclined to sexual intimacy. Kind of at the physical level, women are more inclined to the kind of relational intimacy that comes with that, right? And that's not just to kind of traffic in crass stereotypes, but and simply to say that there are different aspects of a sexual or conjugal life which are appealing. But I think that you want to be able to develop both of those and have them on a firm footing, which puts the relationship first and, subsequently its openness to children in the context of marriage. So, you can think about couples that cohabitate before getting married. Oftentimes, like their troubleshooting or their problem-solving skills are somewhat compromised. One, because they're worried if they have a big blow-up, then they'll be forced to move out, and then they'll have to pay 2 rents instead of 1. But also because, like, sex becomes a way by which to, like, paper over or look over or kind of smooth over problems that may need to be talked out in a more fundamental way. It also becomes, like, the form of recreation, So it's like, we could do something that requires input energy, or we could just, like, watch a movie and then see what happens. So I think that opening the door to sexual intimacy before marriage could potentially short circuit a lot of the necessary maturation and formation that goes into those months leading up to matrimony itself. So that's not like a knockdown, drag out reason for which. But I think that there are other ways by which to assess compatibility. Sexual intimacy is one of those ways. I would argue that it's not the most important way. It would be hard, right, if two partners found themselves unable to give pleasure to each other in the course or in the context of sexual intercourse. So yeah, maybe I need to think about that more. But yeah, maybe those things that I trotted out are some principles. Boom. So thanks to Frida L. Yeah. All right, we're really cooking with gas, cooking with sterno. We got some, like, interesting back and forth about England and Ireland here. Awesome. Great. Cool. All right, here we go. Chris Colaco says, have you read about process philosophy, which speaks about God limited to knowing and his knowing is actualized only when you make a decision? What do you think about this? Yeah, I mean, the typical Thomistic response is that you want to avoid saying anything that would attribute potency to God, because if God can become, he can become better, he can become worse, then it compromises this understanding of God as subsisting being, because then there would be something foreign to his present expression of being. God would necessarily be, like, limited, right? Or in potency to some further actualization, which is really just at the heart of St. Thomas's argumentation. And that emerges from Prima Par's question 2 and 3, where he talks about the divine existence and then subsequently talks about, the divine simplicity. So I would say that those are some basic things. Boom. Now we're going to keep cooking. I just, like, pulled a little wire on the floor and I was terrified that I had unplugged my internet, but this thing tells me that I am still going. So life is good. All right. AML says, following Aquinas 101 course, absolutely fantastic. Yeah, let's go. That's from the Thomistic Institute. Some great stuff there. You can walk with St. Thomas Aquinas. Well, you can't walk with St. Thomas Aquinas. He's dead. You can do... Well, never mind. Okay. But it walks you through the Summa Theologiae and kind of gives you an introduction to the philosophical and theological principles which inform that masterwork. And now it's going beyond into virtues, faith and science, all kinds of sweet stuff. Sweet, sweet. Okay, Hallelujah is holding her own here in the comment section, just straight street. I got some heated conversations about colonialism. That's fascinating. All right, great. All right, V2 Zooey says, is there a moral obligation to buy fair trade chocolate if we know that a lot of chocolate is produced by child labor, or to inform ourselves which products are ethically produced or not? Yes or no? I think so. You don't have a moral obligation to be omniscient, though. So I think that the human heart can only bear so much. The human mind can only encompass so much. So I think it's good to inform yourself as a moral agent, to inform yourself as a consumer, but you're not responsible for knowing everything about everything yesterday. But I think it's good, to go about seeking to be better in consumption such that it's more ethical vis-a-vis the environment, vis-a-vis human ecology more broadly. So, yes. All right. Here we go. Jack Trent says, Father, what are your thoughts on speech? I notice you speak very eloquently. Did you learn this as a skill? Do you ever think this is pretentious, or is it helpful to speak as such? Thank you, Jack. Yeah, it's a good question. I think on the one hand, there are different elements of speech. So I don't think it's good to have many fill words. So I have my own favorites, but the typical ones being and like, a fair share of which I myself say. But then there are other ways by which to kind of stall haltingly in your speech, which would be like, in a certain sense, I say that a lot, or So I think that it's good to have fluid speech because it just makes it easier for your auditor to listen. I don't think that's in any way pretentious. Then there's the consideration of syntax. So I think that it's probably better to speak more concisely, to speak more directly, to speak more concretely, because I think that makes it so that you're able to be understood without necessarily like dumbing anything down. You can speak very well, very clearly, even in kind of brutal prose. So like Ernest Hemingway, for instance, does just that. Then there's the question of your vocalic register. And I think that here there are differences of opinions, like how grandiose of a vocabulary, he says, somewhat knowingly, should you employ? And that's a real question, because I think that sometimes big words can alienate people. So the question is, do those big words matter for the discourse? Are those big words actually helpful for advancing comprehension? Because I don't think the goal is always 100% comprehension, especially in the preaching act, because I think that we're describing mysteries which are beyond the compass of our minds. And so we don't want to make as if to express them like they were comprehensible. And there's a helpful added benefit to a technical vocabulary, because oftentimes those words have been thought about and they're fixed. So I don't think that you should shy away from the word consubstantial, for instance, because it's long, because I think it's very, technically helpful for solidifying that the Father is one in substance with the Son in a particular way. So yeah, and I think, but I also think that there's an aesthetic consideration. I think that speech, insofar as it can be, should be beautiful, because I think that our interactions with other human beings should be pleasant, and we don't want to, just kind of make human discourse more difficult than it need be. So those are all things that I think about. It can be pretentious, and certainly, people have told me that it can be prideful, and people have told me that too. So it's, a thing I got to work on, a thing I got to learn. But no, I haven't really worked on public speaking in a formal way. You just do it a lot, and then maybe you get a little bit better, please God. So yeah, those are some basic thoughts about speech. Yadadi. Whoop. Just killing it over here. Wow, look at this guy. Guys, just like a very lively comment section today. It's just some real sweet action. All right, here we go. KF says, do you recommend any good books for my 10-year-old daughter to read about this subject? I have no idea what you could possibly start with the 10-year-old child. I don't know that there are books out there about the divine attributes. My go-to before you get to college is Lives of Saints, because I think that the best way to learn about God is to learn how inspiring people have known him and loved him and imaged him. So that's my go-to. All right, man, we're just cooking. All right. If a priest adds a word to the words of consecration, like the, where it is not supposed to be, like before eternal covenant, is Eucharist/Mass valid? Yes, it is. So provided that the priest does not change words kind of essential to your understanding of it, and doesn't do, like, so basically what a priest should do is say the words and intend what the church intends. But if his changing of the word does not give you to believe that it's undermining his intention of what the church intends, then you're in the clear. So, like, for instance, do this in remembrance of me, do this in memory of me. Like, if somebody were to, like, confuse those words, right, which I've heard happen, but not to do so maliciously. Like, you have no reason to believe that this priest is tinkering with the Mass. You haven't known him to before, you haven't known him to after. Then I think that's just an honest mistake, and it doesn't undermine the sense of what is being communicated, and that what is communicated effectively mediates the sacramental signification, and so brings about the change in the bread and the wine become the body and the blood. So I would say for trivial words, unimportant words, or for words which are like close cognates, I would say don't worry about that. If a priest is holding on to the words of the translation before 2011, that can be a little more concerning, because it might mean that that he wants to undermine basically the promulgation of that text, which shows a kind of habitual indisposition towards the governance of the church, which is more unsettling. So that might actually be cause for concern, and then you would want to go about addressing that. Boom. Okay, we have come to the end of our hour. So thanks so much for a lively comment section. Thanks so much for your questions. If you haven't yet liked this here video, please do so. If you haven't yet subscribed to Pints with Aquinas, please do so. Push the bell so that way you will be updated the next time a video of this sort comes out. Matt's on his technology fast for August, so things are going to be a little slow. So you can take the opportunity to catch up on all past episodes, and we'll be rip-roaring and ready when things roll around at the beginning of September. If you haven't yet checked out Godsplaining, it's a podcast to which I contribute with other friars of my province. It's, like I said, got the Thomistic Institute, Pints with Aquinas, Godsplaining, working on different registers. So do check that out. Short episodes each week for your commute, helping you to cast a contemplative gaze on all things ordinary and exalted. Just kind of Catholic miscellany that I think you'll enjoy. So check out Godsplaining, subscribe to the channel on YouTube, or to the podcast on whatever app you use. And until next time, my prayers are for you. Please pray for me. And we'll see you in a week. Cheers.